Hello, everyone. We are Hypercube, and we are here with composer Philip Schuessler. His piece, Liminal Bridges, is on our new album called Brain on Fire. And we are going to chat with him a little bit about the piece and his life as a composer. Phil, you and I have actually known each other for a little while. I first got wind of your music as a master's student at Stony Brook University. And our good buddy, Mike McCurdy, played your percussion solo piece. And I remember thinking like, oh, that's a really cool piece. I got to get to know that guy. And then I guess maybe 4 or 5 years later, the group Mantra Percussion, we played a piece called Ripple. And that was for guitar quartet and percussion quartet, if I remember correctly. And then I think a few years after that, I played another piece of yours called Duet for Quartet. And that was a percussion quartet that I remember it was all very soft sounds. And then gradually after that, there was a flute and percussion duo that I had. And we played your piece, I think it was the Witch on Bear Mountain. And that interaction there, I think, was what led to the piece that you wrote for Hypercube eventually. If I remember correctly, I did the tour of the flute percussion duo. And then after that tour, we went to your school and performed for you in your festival. And we got talking about, well, I had this other group for guitar, saxophone, piano, percussion that's really cool. I think you would really like it. And, maybe we could come down here and play for your festival and you can write us a piece. And I think that's how the piece originally started. And I might be wrong on this, but I think it's our first commission piece on the album. So of the pieces that are on that record, this was the first one that was written for us and the first one that we performed and toured extensively. So it's been a nice, long, gradual communication and relationship working with you. And definitely very, very excited and pleased with how your piece turned out. So I'm going to ask the first question. It's kind of like a two-part question. I was kind of interested in how you came up with the pitch sets for the piece. I remember you had 3 very specific percussion instruments that you sort of derived those pitches from for the piece. And then how did you come up with the title of the piece as well?
Yeah, well, the first thing I will mention is to speak to your kind of lineage of what led to this piece. If I could real quick just mention that, because it's really interesting you mentioning that the lineage of pieces and how we met, how we had a mutual friend, Mike, who we were all Stony Brookers. And I was just thinking back about kind of one of the reasons that I went to Stony Brook in the first place was to nurture this exact thing, the connection of performers and composers in these different kind of ripple effects of collaborations that happen. And that's one of the things that I really loved about going to that school, because we, I don't know if we actually overlapped at Stony Brook. I mean, we might have a year, but I didn't know you really when I was actually physically at Stony Brook. And yet we have been able to generate this really great lineage of pieces that have sort of culminated in this piece, which is a really great thing. And that's not something you get in every institution where you have.
I think the year that I arrived, you had left, but were maybe still finishing up to some extent, but I don't think you were on campus or anything like that at that point. I think Mike McCurdy is the real link that like set this whole thing into motion. That's knowing him.
That was kind of the scene, while I was there. I don't know how things are now, but that was definitely the scene there where people were connecting with each other in these different ways and making real things happen, just pretty cool. But as far as to your question about the pitch content of this piece, I think is very important part of the piece in the sense that the pitch content is sort of what generates the narrative of the piece in a way. And for a long time, I've been interested in spectral music. And when you listen to this piece, there's no secret. It's, you kind of hear this sort of blend of timbre and pitch in these kind of microtonal ways a little bit. But I'm not necessarily out to try to make a piece sound spectral. It's just kind of the way that it came out. But when I first was sort of conceiving of this piece and the instrumentation for the piece, I knew that I wanted to basically build some collections of pitches that were somewhat related, but quite distinct from one another. And one approach I took to doing that was to find different metallophones and get their pitch content and use that as the source material for the entire piece. And I wanted to kind of take it a step further, not just pick random instruments, random percussion instruments, but percussion instruments that were very, for whatever reason, personal to me. So, because I have a sort of my own sort of personal collection of various instruments. It's very small, but it's, you know, it's something. So I have these instruments that I've collected over the years for various reasons. I'm not a percussionist, but collecting these instruments. So I have like a cowbell I got from a trip I took to Paris once, and a gong that we bought for our organization, Versapelny Music in New Orleans. We needed to buy a gong for a performance of a piece once, so we bought that. And the third instrument is a singing bowl that I use. Actually, I have about 4 or 5 pieces that I've used over the years that generate source material directly from the same cowbell, or the same singing bowl, Tibetan singing bowl. And so they each have, they're each in common in that they're metal, but they all have their own sort of frequency content. It's all inharmonic, sort of biting dissonances within the realm of certain tonal centers. Like, and so I wanted to basically generate sections of the piece that were each sort of had this pitch content housed in it in some way. And then try to find connectors or links or transitions between those different sections. And the title of the piece is sort of a reference to that, liminal, meaning sort of transition or between states. And it's a term that was used by Gerard Griset, French composer, to describe his music, in particular, sort of music that tries to touch on the betweenness of things, sort of music that's always like, is perpetually in transition, and that there's never sort of a point of arrival. It's always morphing and changing in different ways. So that's sort of a tip of the cap to Griset in a way. But I think in the long run, Liminal Bridges probably has a even nerdier reference subtext, in that it's there's some sort of video game, I forget, that I pulled from that has that term in it, some buried somewhere, and I wrote it down in my notebook and said I'm going to use that for the title at some point.
That's very cool. Yeah, it's interesting how composers come up with titles and what gives them the inspiration or the idea for that title. And I think it's awesome that the pitch spectrum is kind of derived from percussion instruments. I'm a little bit biased.
I'm sure.
I think that's pretty awesome. So I think, Andrea, you have a question that sort of kind of connects the tissue here with the Stony Brook lineage.
Yeah, and I actually have a two-part question as well, because what you just said brought up another question in my mind. My first question relates to our lineage and how we're all, because Jay and I also graduated from Stony Brook, we're all sort of connected through that. And I know you also were a composition fellow at NIFNORF, which we're all connected with as well. We performed at NIFNORF a couple years ago, and a few of us are permanently part of NIFNORF. So I wonder how those experiences shaped your compositional language, and how sort of working with either your fellow students at Stony Brook, or, well, I know that it helped nurture future projects. But in terms of your own personal style, how did these institutions or connections and festivals with Neef North, like how did they contribute to your style? So that's my first question.
It's funny you mentioned Neef North, because that was, I think, the second year of Neef North that I attended. It was 2012, and I had such an amazing experience there. And actually, the piece that I submitted for performance was the duet for quartet, Chris, which is the piece I wrote for Ictus. So it ended up being played by the percussion folks at Neef North as well, which is really fun. But yeah, I mean, I love these summer institutions and these different opportunities to meet new people, new performers, and different composers and pedagogues, historians and musicologists. And one of the things in particular about Neef North that I like so much is that they couch it with seminars. So while Neef North was going on, there was a seminar on John Cage taking place, and they invited Kyle Gann to give a talk. And I think this was around the time that his book on 4 minutes and 33 seconds came out. And so you get this sort of cross-pollination of specialities, it's kind of commingling of a lot of different musicians doing a lot of different things. So it makes for fertile ground for unknown things to kind of crop up out of there. And one of the things that I like in particular about these things is that of course exposes you to new ideas. It broadens your awareness of what's happening, and it kind of gets you out of your sort of myopia. The older I get, the more limited my social interactions get to be. I have a child and I have a house that I have, and you have all these become more and more sort of, internalized in your own selfish interests or whatever. And so to have these moments where you can kind of freely interact with people and ideas is really liberating. And I definitely get that in these groups. It's really interesting when we talk about this piece, Liminal Bridges. It seemed to be, in a lot of ways, sort of a culminating point for a lot of ideas that I was having. I wanted to sort of smash them all together at once. So these sort of new things that at the time that I was writing, that I was really getting into, were sort of being kind of butted up against things that I had been doing for a long time, and finding a grammar, a musical grammar that would sort of connect the old with the new is something that I realized I was doing after the fact. When I was writing this piece, you don't really realize at the time that you're having all of these convergences of musical ideas, but you look back and you look back at this music and the thing that you made, and you say, oh yeah, of course, I was taking this idea from here and this idea from there and kind of connecting them together. And that was definitely happening in this piece in particular. You are well aware that there's a lot of moments in this piece that are very, very intensely quiet, and that you have these moments where there's all this sort of rhythmic filigree going on, and you're not really sure what's happening inside of it. And that's sort of a lot from my interest that stems way back, my interest in sort of these Morton Feldman type of sound worlds, these ethereal atmospheres. And then there's a lot of these other moments in the piece where you have these really kind of percussive, violent ruptures that take place. And that's sort of a new thing that I've started injecting in my music more and more, along with these more sort of hyper weird rhythmic structures, these asymmetrical rhythmic patterns that are not always lined up perfectly. It's kind of somewhat complexity-ish type of thing going on. But
Awesome, thanks. That's probably a good point to move to the excerpt that we have. We can actually listen to some of that kind of rhythmic interaction you're talking about and listen to it as well. So this is an excerpt from the first half of the piece. And
it's highlighted right where the excerpt begins, and I'll try and follow with the score.
Awesome. Just listening to that reminds me of how much rehearsal time we spent putting those various sections together. So I think Jay has a question in the realm of like rhythm, which I think is probably a good time to maybe segue to, because you did touch on that a little bit, Philip. So Jay, I'll let you take it away on that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that took so much time probably in rehearsal was trying to line up some of these, really complex rhythms, sort of dotted rhythms within quintuplets, and almost like the Morse code quality and the texture, and then it all sort of comes together in these like sort of big unison hits. And then there seems to be a sort of larger rhythmic structure throughout the piece, and sort of these transitions, metric modulations, and the whole thing seems to have a very like the rhythm is in many ways is like the largest sort of musical idea that sort of runs throughout the piece. I wonder if you could just talk about some of that and what makes it work so well.
Yeah, I mean, as a composer, I don't know, Jay, you're a composer, Aaron, you're a composer. I don't know if you've had this experience, but it seems to be that there's so many instances where you write something and you look back on it and you're like, what was I thinking at that moment? I've really, not to be like, not to be light about it, but it really seems to be a phenomenon where you look back on something that you did even just 2 days ago and you're like, I have no idea what I was thinking. It's almost like I'm almost a little bit hesitant to take credit for a piece, because I was like, did I actually write that or not? But I mean, I'm being lighthearted in one sense, but in another sense, there's really is some truth to it, where you're so kind of locked into an idea that when you are removed from it, you kind of lose that flow state or whatever it is. But I do recall having this very kind of pointed idea that rhythm was going to be sort of the heart of this work. Writing rhythms in a convincing manner is probably the most challenging thing for me to do as a composer. Something that is compelling and engaging and convincing to the listener, that it's playable for the performer, and is actually articulating what it is I think I want to articulate. And getting those three things lined up in a perfect alignment is virtually impossible for me. So when I see that anything that even remotely hits the mark, I take great pride in it. But I mentioned how this piece was sort of a convergence of ideas from old and the new. And one thing that I started exploring at the time of writing this piece, and that I continue to explore, is intricate rhythms, and finding rhythms that create these sort of what I tend to call filigree, where it's sort of a stochastic thing where you don't hear, as a listener, you don't hear the precise things that are happening. You hear sort of the overall effect. Is something that I'm trying to sort of explore in a way, in an effective way. But in order to get that effect of not being able to hear or sense precision, you have to overcompensate and be more precise with the rhythms. So you end up getting these weird nested tuplets and these kind of odd asymmetrical things where you have a line of, I don't know, like 30 seconds non-uplets or something and then you put a dotted one in the weirdest place. And I know that as performers, you absolutely love that. But that was sort of part of that was the challenge of making that work, both for the listener and for the performer as best as possible.
Yeah, well, you nailed it. It's honestly, somehow or another, it all really works, and even the most complex moments are like the most enjoyable to play and the most sort of musically satisfying. So.
And I should add, it's super fun to rehearse and perform too. We love programming this piece. I remember one of the first couple times we played this piece, I couldn't stop smiling while we were playing it. I'm serious. It sounds like, yeah, I just was so happy when we were actually performing this piece and when we got it to work, because it's a piece that, like, it makes so much sense when we actually got the metric modulations and the complexities of the rhythms and the dynamics and everything, all those colors. It's just so enjoyable to work on. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's certainly very, very cool. So Aaron, I think you had a question as well. If you'd like to
Sure,
start
yeah.
with that.
Well, I was actually going to ask you about your composition trajectory from here on, and you touched a little bit on that just now, talking about exploring rhythm further. I guess specifically, or one thing I'd like to say I really enjoyed about Liminal Bridges is the idea of the really complex rhythm that you're talking about, but also the balance of that to moments of complete unison. And then, as Andrea mentioned, the metric modulation, which also implies a relationship kind of thing. So I would love to know a little bit more about that before, kind of go on about what's in the future for you in terms of what you're exploring next, musically and, career-wise, ensemble-wise, what you're writing for.
Well, I mean, when you all first asked me to write this piece, I was kind of, I was at a loss for words, because this instrumentation sort of kind of fits my wheelhouse for what I was wanting to explore. I mean, I've always had a background of interest in rock music, and you can't help but, in a lot of senses, feel the urge as a rock musician and the opportunity to write for electric guitar in particular, but put that with percussion and then saxophone, and you have this really great recipe for doing something that at least pays some sort of homage to that. And in a lot of ways, although it might not be detectable for everyone, there is a little bit of that undercurrent in this piece where you have these moments where there's this sort of hard driven, almost like progressive moments of kind of everything kind of aligns together in a sort of this fast driven kinetic way. And so there's that sort of underpinning underneath everything else. which is, again, kind of points to me wanting to put everything that I've done in the past and I wanted to do together into this one project. As far as like my trajectory, I'm not entirely certain what lies ahead. I do find that I do end up writing in this sort of trend of music that gets more intensely complex, and then I kind of wind back down to music that seeks simplicity with a lot of, tributaries and side adventures along the way. But I think I've kind of currently hit a point where I've hit sort of maximum what I want to do in terms of the complexity side. Not to say I'll never come back to it, but I want to write a music that's as simple as it needs to be, or as complicated or complex as it needs to be. I don't seek out to try my hardest to write complex music or simple music, but these days I have this need to make things as simple as possible on so many levels, not just music, but life in general. And that helps because things inevitably get complicated. No matter what you try to do to keep things simple, they're going to get complicated. So you find ways to mitigate that complexity or that complicatedness the best you can. So I just finished a piece for clarinet and piano that I thought was just going to be kind of this piece. I had this idea, it was sort of locked in place, crystallized in my mind as to what I wanted it to be, and that I could knock the thing out. And it ended up taking, like 8 months to write, which is a really long time for me. So I'm not on the downslope of that. And the next thing I want to do is a piece that just says what it needs to say and is done. The less is more is such a cliche, but it cliche for a reason. I think it's because a lot of people say it because it works in a sense. So I'm working on music that sort of takes a step back from that sort of filigree stuff and has these sort of hushed moments where I want to use space and quasi-silence as a musical device and seek out a way to do that that is personal and still has my compositional voice in it. So
excellent, that's awesome. So let's maybe take a listen to the second excerpt that we have for everyone to listen to.
Okay, so this is from I guess about 2/3 way through the piece, and there's a lot of like extended techniques and timbral effects in this section.
Yeah, we have extended techniques inside the piano in particular.
That was awesome. Cool. Thanks, guys. Philip, you're going to be writing Jay and I like a duet. That's sort of like a brother sister piece to the Liminal Bridges. Is that still the idea?
absolutely. At least,
Cool.
yeah, for now, that's the idea, but we'll see where it goes.
Yeah,
I'm really looking forward to it.
yeah,
Awesome.
Yeah.
great.
Cool, man. All right, guys. We'll see you all later, okay?
Thanks, everybody, and stay
Yeah, you're
safe.
welcome.
And I'm looking forward to seeing you all in person.